I'm going to start with a limited value study with just values 3 and 7. So when we're mixing a mid-value 5, we want to have 2 units of white and equal amount of black. We're going to be mixing up enough that we can then use this to make other mixtures. For value 7, I'm going to take 1 part of the value 5, and I'm actually going to take 3 parts of white. Value 3, we're just mixing from scratch. 3 parts black and 1 part white. Okay. So I mixed up values 7 and value 5 and value 3. And these are just with ivory black and titanium white. So I'm going to start with a limited value study, kind of a posterized value study with just values 3 and 7. So I'm using a dark and a light, but I'm shifting them towards the middle. And then I'm going to paint on top of that with intermediate values. So this is Stonehenge oil paper. So it's a little bit absorbent. So first I'm going to put down a layer of oil. I'm going to use oleo gel. So I'm just going to squeeze a little bit out on the palette. Normally, one of the reasons I like oleo gel is that it has a little bit, it's basically refined linseed oil, but it has a little bit of fumed silica mixed in with it to give it a gel-like consistency, so you can put it on your palette and ordinarily it won't run down. But I have several tubes that are years old, several years old, and so sometimes they'll separate a little bit. So this is running down the palette, which is fine. So I'm just gonna take a little bit of that, and I'm brushing the oil into the paper. And I've just made a cutout of a circle to kind of keep myself within the bounds of my composition. So I'm brushing this on so that when I paint the darker values on top, well, first of all, any paint that I put on top will flow a little bit more easily onto the surface. And second of all, the darker values will, if on an absorbent surface, they'll tend to sink in. So the oil sinks into the surface and leaves the pigment underbound, and that can cause it to appear matte and lighter in value for the darker values that you paint. And so giving it a coat of oil first allows me to maintain those values a little bit better, as well as having a nicer glide to the paint as I put it on. I don't want to put too much on, I want it to just be a thin layer. And if you just have refined linseed oil, you can use that as well. So because I'm working small, I'm going to use a fairly small synthetic filbert to apply this paint. This is a soft brush, but it's not quite as soft as some of the sable-like brushes that I have. It's a little stiffer than that. But I'm just looking for something that's about the right size that I can apply paint. I might choose something a little bit bigger, but this is just what I grabbed to begin with. And I want to have one for each color, so I'm going to have 2 brushes approximately kind of similar in shape and size to apply the paint. And one of the reasons I don't want to put too much oil on the surface is that I want the paint to be fairly opaque, because I want the colors that I'm choosing on the palette to be the colors that end up on the surface. So I don't want to use too much of the transparency of oil paint I'm trying to cover. But I also don't want to paint too thickly, because I want to be able to paint over this. And with this particular paper, because it's absorbent, there's downsides and upsides to that. Because it's absorbent, I can put down an initial layer and then pretty much paint on top of that without it mushing together too much or picking up the paint that's underneath, basically, is what would happen if I were painting on a less absorbent surface. I couldn't paint directly over an underlayer so easily right away, because it would lift off the paint that was underneath or disturb it in some way. So this just makes it a little easier to work in layers without waiting for it to dry. So I'm going to start out by taking a look at the simplified version of the reference that I've made. This is just going to be a quick value study. I'm not going to get too detailed, but I am going to start putting in intermediate values after I start with these first two. So like I said, I've divided it up into value 3, the purple, and value 7, the yellow. And eventually I want the value 5, so I just put it in there. I used it to mix. I have the formulas for the mixing guide, and I used the value 5 to mix the value 7 with some white added. So I'm going to start with value 3 because then the light of the paper will stand in for value 7 until I am able to paint it. If I did it the other way, the value 7 would be darker than the paper and the value relationships would be reversed, and so it would be a little confusing. So I'm taking some value 3, and it's going to be pretty much all the way over on the left side. So I'm painting thinly but opaquely. And I'm kind of making sure that I push my brush into the surface so that I fill in all the texture of the paper. And a little less than halfway, that shadow breaks kind of at the side of her nose. And let's see how well I can get the proportions, just kind of really simplifying this and eyeballing it. And somewhere about there, her shoulder comes in. And hopefully this will be somewhat of a forgiving process, so I don't have to get the shapes exactly right on the first attempt. I'll be kind of refining as I go. So something like that for her chin, and then there's a little bit of light on her cheek. Eventually that's going to be darker than value 7, but for now we're going to just split things into 2 values. So I'm not gonna, because I'm, the size of my brush and the size of the painting, I'm not going to get super detailed with the shapes, especially in this first initial statement. Once I have something down, I'm doing my best to get I'm not working site size. Usually I would have a reference that's printed out the same size or zoomed to the same size right next to my study if I were doing a demo. But this time I just have it over to the side on my iPad because I didn't want to print it out. So it's a little more difficult to get the shapes in the right place that way, but of course it's better practice to be able to it gives you a little more flexibility if you're not always working site size. So I'm seeing that my shapes are quite off. I have the bottom of the nose too high, and I think the corner of the mouth too high. So it's just partly, I painted this shape of the mouth in, but I'm using a larger brush, so I painted it too large, and that made me move the nose up. So I'm gonna just leave that for now, since I don't have the other color to correct with yet. But I'll start to fix it once I'm I have some of the value 7 on my brush. Okay, so something like that. So again, I don't want to paint it too gloppy. It's just a thin layer, but it's opaque. So now instead of trying to clean that brush, I'm going to switch to a new brush. It's pretty similar, just a synthetic filbert. And I'm going to go into value 7. So because the value 7, it's going to mix somewhat with the paint that I've put down as I paint over it, over the value 3. So I'm going to start in the areas that don't have any of the value 3 and then work out from there. So that way those areas will remain more clean, and the areas that are overlapping I'll paint next. So even though, with this paper, the paint somewhat sinks in a little bit, so the new layer of paint will sit on top to some degree, better than if we were working on a non-absorbent surface. But it doesn't completely keep the paint from mixing together, so that's why I'm starting with the lighter areas. Okay, so now the corrections and the transitions. Now I'm not going to necessarily paint the transitions as in blending them, but I mean the areas where the edges basically of one value to the next. So I know that the bottom of the nose needs to come down, so I'm just going to push that down, and you can see that it paints over the darker value quite well. I need to move this down also, and because I have such a simplified value statement in my reference that I've created for myself, it makes it a lot easier to see the shapes. Of course, if you're doing this from a life or from a reference where you haven't done this extreme posterization, you may use the technique of squinting to see the dominant value shapes. You kind of have to learn this way of seeing to simplify the values. But doing exercises like this can give you an idea of what that's going to look like when you attempt to do it, sort of eyeballing it. So my idea is that I want to work back and forth with these two extreme values before starting to make details and transitions. So I'm really getting the big shapes correct first. One thing that's a little confusing is the way that I don't know if I can just rub this off of the, I'm just going to put a little bit of value 7 here because I want to see the edge of that circle, and it's a little bit distracting me from the actual shape when I have the over paint at the edge there. So I'm just kind of going around. All right, let's see. I think that the chin here is a little bit too over to the left and a little bit too low. So what I want to do is grab my other brush, my darker brush, and I'm going to paint over that edge. I'm just going to push that up. So you see how nicely it lays over the value 7 paint and doesn't mix too much with it. I'm trying not to press too hard as well. If I press a little harder, it starts to mix together. So as I push the bottom of the chin up, that shape becomes too small, so I know I need to push that, the top edge of it up as well, that light shape. I'm not going to worry about this line right now. I want to, you know, when I posterize it, there's little sort of dithered shapes that happen. I'm also wiping my brush off with a paper towel frequently, by the way, so that, because you see that little spot had a little bit of value 7 in there that's starting to mix in. So I want to make sure as I'm painting over the value 7 and picking it up on my value 3 brush, I wipe that off before I go and get some more value 3, and then I can kind of paint that in. What I was going to say is that, like, this little line right here, there's like not a solid line for the crease of her jaw and chin, or the jaw coming over her neck. I'm not going to paint that in right now because I'm really trying to get the large shapes. I'm focusing on the larger shapes. This shape, the dark shape of the side of her face and her hair, it needs to be a little bit wider, so I need to push the light of her face in a little bit. So this is kind of mass drawing. You know, so instead of doing a detailed pencil drawing to begin with, or even a detailed brush drawing, we're really working with masses of shape and value right from the beginning, rather than with line at all. So we're working with edges, but we're really working with shapes more than line. So the eye socket needs to pull over to the left. It might be a little bit, maybe a little bit low in places. See, again, I'm going to wipe my brush off, go back into the value 3. I'm just getting a little bit of paint on my brush. I still don't want it to be really gloppy because I'm going to continue painting into this or over it with, even after I finish these adjustments with the 2 values, I'm going to continue to paint transitional values on top. So I don't want a lot of gloppy paint. So I'm trying to keep it a really good balance of being opaque but not thick. And anytime I'm overlapping the value 7 brush or value 7 area, good practice is to wipe off my brush. If I notice any ridges of, like, gloppy ridges of paint where there's a physical thickness being built up, I'm going to kind of brush that out with my brush so that it is more flat. Okay, now painting the bottom of the nose would be easier if I had a smaller brush. Or if I have a smaller brush, obviously, but if I were going to use a smaller brush. But I don't want to get into a smaller brush yet because I really want to focus on these big shapes. So I'm guessing that's going to be about there. I'm not going to pull it out all the way because what I'm doing is I'm just starting to pull that shape out from the larger mass of dark. These little tiny peninsulas that are coming out, I think I'm going to hold off on that because I think it's going to be easier to judge if I have it in the right place first and then put out that little tiny sliver of shadow under her nose. This is basically a light and shadow division. It's not perfect because when you're using posterize function in Photoshop, it doesn't know what's light and what's shadow. It's just taking the tonal value information from the digital image. So it's not necessarily going to be exactly split into light and shadow, but it's pretty close. Okay. I'm going to go back to my light brush and I notice that the eye socket, I need to start to push this a little bit further over and higher, the light shape there. And again, painting over the value 5, or sorry, over the darker value with my lighter brush, I'm going to wipe that off now and go back into value 7. And I need to pull the dark shape over further to the right as well, where it's like crossing the bridge of her nose or crossing the glabella, that part between the eyes. And I need to deal with this chin down here, so I'm going to, let's see, wipe off my brush, go back into value 7, and I'm going to push this up. And because I'm working with these large shapes, I haven't even been using my maul stick yet. I'm just kind of not bracing my hand on anything. I'm just kind of putting it down and like steadying it on the canvas. Keeps me from being too fiddly. But as I start to refine it, then I will get into using my maul stick. Okay, I'm going to go back to the dark brush because I definitely see some shapes that need to be adjusted. So I'm getting some paint on my brush, and then I'm going to push this up slightly. I forgot to wipe my brush, so I'm getting a little bit of lighter color there. It's not such a big deal. I just don't want it to become, I want these to stay very clear divisions between the light and the dark, and I don't want there to be soft transitions at this point yet. Wipe my brush off, go back into the value 3. I'm going to bring this shape, wipe it off again, bring this shape over. And as I get things closer, I'm feeling like I really want to be using my maul stick, but I'm holding off for a little bit longer. A little highlight on the hair there. I'm not sure that was. Let's see. I can tell the light on the far cheek needs to be pushed over slightly. And just kind of glancing back and forth. Push the edge of the chin over a little bit. Let's try putting this little shape in. The right side of the chin's looking a little off. It needs to come up And then this shape, the light shape there, needs to be wider. So let me go back into my light brush. And I can I think the shoulder needs to be pushed up a little further there on the right. This side of the face is still too far over to the right, so I'm going to go back to the dark brush and just nudge that shape over. Push this shape up a little bit there. Go back to the light brush. Get this to be a little narrower at the corner of her mouth. This comes down and this pushes up, so I push that up and I'm going to push this down. And again, wiping off my brush. See, I feel like this is, this area is maybe needs to still come over a little bit. Maybe I'll just try moving the light shape on the cheek. So if you put a stroke down and then you continue to keep painting, the paint will kind of start to mush together, especially after, I've been making these many corrections. It's starting to build up a little on the surface. So you want to just like put 1 or 2 strokes down, wipe the brush off, get some more paint. Apply it as thinly as you can while still covering. And there's a little break somewhere in there. Don't want to get too fiddly, but notice kind of around the eye socket, I could refine that a little bit. Some of the things, will get refined as I start to paint in transitional values, so I don't want to go too far because that will end up probably building up too much paint on the surface when I want to wait to do that until I have the transitional values mixed up. So painting this, reshaping the eye socket a little bit. And then that light above her brow on her forehead. And get my dark brush again. Dark brush is a little bit larger than, and like not quite as, it's a little bit more like mohawky of a brush than the light brush, so it's a little harder to get the smaller shapes. Okay, now I'm starting to brace my hand on the easel, so I probably want to be using my maul stick soon. But I'm just kind of seeing how far I can get, keeping things much more general and broad. I go back to the dark brush and push this light shape a little further. Now the chin looks a little bit off, so let me go back to the light brush and I think I need to just pull this down maybe a touch. And then maybe push the dark shape next to it up a little bit. I have my paint a little bit thick there. That might cause problems later on. So I'm going to just kind of brush it out a little bit. And what was I going to do? Oh yeah. And then I'm going to paint on top of that with intermediate values.